The sidewalk on West 46th Street smelled of wet concrete and cigarette smoke when the gun came out. Not fired, not raised, just revealed slow enough for everyone to see. At 11:42 a.m. on April 15, 1936, a Mafia captain unbuttoned his coat in full daylight and let the steel rest in his palm, angled low, deliberate, unmistakable. Traffic moved. A delivery truck stalled. A shoeshine boy stopped mid-brush. Men who made a living pretending not to notice things suddenly noticed everything. Lucky Luciano stood less than 3 feet away. No bodyguard stepping forward. No hand reaching inside his own jacket. Just stillness. His eyes dropped not in fear but in calculation. The humiliation was complete because it was witnessed by clerks leaning out of windows, by numbers runners, pretending to count change, by a woman across the street who folded her newspaper too slowly. This was not rage, this was theater. And everyone there understood the rule being tested: once power is challenged in public, it must answer in private or it disappears forever. Luciano said nothing. That silence did more damage than any punch could have. Somewhere nearby, a coffee cup rattled against a saucer as a man's hand shook. Somewhere else, a clock kept perfect time, indifferent to the countdown that had just begun. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Before we go any further, drop a comment telling us your local time and where you're watching from. Because from this moment forward, there was no path back, only a path through. By noon, the story had already changed shape. By evening, it had become fixed. No one argued about what happened on West 46th Street. They argued about why Lucky Luciano didn't respond. Men replayed it with their hands tracing the angle of the gun in the air, stopping just short of where it had rested. Some said the captain's finger never entered the trigger guard. Others swore it did, just barely enough to make the point irreversible. The details shifted, but the silence didn't. Luciano's silence stayed perfectly intact, as if it had been poured into concrete. At 1:10 p.m., Luciano was seen at Lindy's, same table near the wall, same posture. He ordered coffee, untouched sugar packet beside the cup, and listened while 2 men spoke too much. He nodded once. That was it. No anger, no vows, no instructions anyone could quote later, which was exactly what unsettled people. Because rage was familiar, restraint was not. Public humiliation was supposed to trigger chaos, shouting blood spectacle. Instead, what followed was administrative, quiet, almost boring. A man folded a newspaper at the wrong page. Another checked a watch that was already accurate. Somewhere downtown, a clerk added figures twice, then tore the page out of his notebook and burned it in an ashtray. By nightfall, the first rule had already taken hold. No one repeated the captain's name out loud. This was how power actually moved in the 1930s, not through orders, but through absence. When Luciano didn't retaliate immediately, he reframed the insult. It was no longer a challenge between 2 men. It became a test of systems, of loyalty, of memory. There was a statistic that circulated quietly that week, never written down. In 1936 New York, more than 70% of organized crime revenue moved through fewer than 12 transportation routes. Everyone in the room knew the number. Everyone knew what it implied. A man could draw a gun, but only another man could decide when the city stopped cooperating. At 9:02 p.m., Luciano walked out alone. A silent look passed between him and a waiter who had served him for years. No words, just an understanding that something had shifted and it wasn't over. Across the city, the captain drank too much and laughed too loudly. That mattered. People noticed excess before they noticed danger. He told the story himself, embellishing, adjusting angles, savoring the way listeners leaned in. Every retelling widened the circle of witnesses. Every witness deepened the wound. And still nothing happened. That was the point. Because when retaliation is immediate, it feels emotional. When it is delayed, it feels inevitable. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, the humiliation stopped belonging to Luciano. It became communal property. Everyone who had seen it, heard it, whispered it. They all carried a piece of the responsibility now. By the next morning, men woke with the same unspoken understanding: this would not be settled loudly. It would be settled correctly. No gunshots yet, no warnings issued. Just a city holding its breath, waiting for a silence to turn into motion. The countdown did not arrive as a threat. It arrived as a courtesy. On April 16, 1936, at exactly 7:30 a.m., a man who sold fruit near the Fulton Fish Market mentioned casually that a certain captain had 3 days. He said it the way someone mentions a weather change. No emphasis, no drama, just information. By noon, the same phrase surfaced on Mulberry Street, then near the docks on the East River, then in a barber shop where the radio played too loud. Always the same number, never explained, never written down. 3 days was not symbolic, it was logistical. In 1936, perishable goods moving through Manhattan spoiled fast. Fish in under 24 hours, meat in 48. Illegal liquor, if held too long, drew attention. 3 days was the outer edge before operations collapsed under their own weight. Everyone who mattered understood that without being told. That was the brilliance of it. At 10:15 a.m., Luciano was seen entering an office above a tailor on Mott Street. He carried no papers. He left with none. Inside, a confiscated notebook lay open on the desk, its pages blank except for dates and initials that meant nothing to outsiders. A man turned the notebook sideways, then closed it. Decisions had already been made elsewhere. By early afternoon, routes began to change. Trucks took longer paths. Drivers claimed detours that didn't exist. A warehouse door that usually opened at dusk stayed shut. None of it was dramatic. That was the danger. Violence announces itself. Infrastructure withdraws quietly. A folded newspaper appeared on a cafe table near Canal Street, left behind by mistake or not. On page 6, a small statistic caught the eye of anyone trained to notice such things in the first quarter of 1936. Port inspections had increased by 18%. That meant delays. Delays meant exposure. Exposure meant vulnerability. The clock wasn't ticking loudly, but it was ticking everywhere. By nightfall, the captain sensed something was wrong. His calls weren't returned. A car that usually waited across the street was gone. When he reached for a cigarette, his hand paused in the air a fraction too long. That hesitation mattered. Fear always arrives as a delay before it becomes a thought. At 11:00 p.m., a message reached him indirectly. Not a warning. A clarification. 3 days meant 72 hours from the moment the gun had been shown. The deadline was precise. This wasn't vengeance, it was accounting. Across the city, the community adjusted without instruction. Shopkeepers closed early. Dock workers took sudden sick days. A driver lost a set of keys. No one discussed Luciano by name. They didn't have to. Cooperation was assumed, not negotiated. Refusal would have been louder than participation. By the second night, the captain stopped drinking. That detail spread quickly. Sobriety under pressure signaled recognition. He wasn't panicking. He was calculating. But calculations require inputs, and his inputs were disappearing. Statistics later showed that within 48 hours, nearly 60% of the captain's usual distribution capacity had stalled. At the time, no one called it that. They just noticed the absence, empty crates, unused docks, a ledger with no new entries. Somewhere a clock struck midnight. No one jumped. Because everyone knew the most dangerous moment was not when the deadline arrived, but when it passed without noise. Retaliation did not begin with a weapon, it began with a list. On April 17, 1936, at 6:05 a.m., a man crossed Delancey Street carrying a folded scrap of paper small enough to disappear in his sleeve. No names, only addresses. Times, 2-letter abbreviations that meant nothing unless you already knew. This was how violence stayed invisible until it was unavoidable. The first move was transportation. A garage in Brooklyn that serviced 3 of the captain's trucks failed to open. The owner claimed a broken lock. At 8:20 a.m., a dispatcher on the west side called in sick for the first time in 12 years. By noon, 2 dock foremen refused shipments without explanation, citing paperwork that had never been required before. Each action taken alone was meaningless. Together they formed pressure. At 1:30 p.m., a safe house in Queens was quietly emptied. No panic, no packing. Just men leaving at staggered intervals, each carrying less than they arrived with. A confiscated notebook changed hands there, its pages already memorized then destroyed. Information did not travel anymore. It evaporated. The captain tried to respond. He sent a man to check a warehouse near the river. The man returned with nothing to report because there was nothing to see. Doors locked, lights off. A single coffee cup sat on a crate cold untouched as if someone had stepped away mid-sip and never returned. That image stuck. Abandonment always feels personal. By the second afternoon, favors were called in and quietly declined. That was new. Refusals used to come with apologies, with explanations. Now, they came with silence. A driver looked past him on the street. A bookmaker crossed the road. These were not betrayals. They were acknowledgments. The community had already decided where gravity pointed. Statistics would later show that organized crime operations depended on fewer than 24 critical nodes: garages, docks, phone lines, safe apartments. That afternoon, half of them went dark. No explosions, no sirens, just absence spreading like a shadow with no source. At 7:10 p.m., the captain sat alone in a back room and unfolded a newspaper he had no intention of reading. His hand trembled once, then steadied. He had drawn steel in public to demonstrate dominance. Now, dominance was being measured in minutes lost in calls, unanswered in rooms that no longer felt safe. This was not a fight. It was a dismantling. The final logistical move came without drama. A route that had always been available always suddenly wasn't. No explanation, no alternative offered. Men who depended on that route simply didn't show up. That silence was louder than gunfire. By night, the city adjusted again. Streets emptied earlier. Conversations shortened. Everyone understood the principle at work: retaliation that exposes infrastructure leaves no martyrs, only consequences. When the captain finally stood, he noticed something small and terrifying. His shadow on the wall was thinner than it had been days before, not shorter. Thinner, as if the light itself had begun to refuse him substance. Outside, rain began to fall, steady, unremarkable washing chalk marks from the sidewalk where roots had once been drawn. By morning, there would be no visible trace of what was happening. Only a city rearranged. By the third day, the city had learned how to look away. April 18th, 1936, Saturday. The streets were busier than they had been all week, as if normal life had been deliberately scheduled to overlap with something dangerous. Grocers argued over prices. A shoemaker hammered soles into place. A woman balanced a bag of oranges on her hip and laughed too loudly at nothing. It was not denial. It was cooperation. At 10:40 a.m., the captain stepped out of a building on East Houston Street and realized he was walking through a crowd that had already decided not to see him. Men who would normally nod did not. A driver let the engine idle but never made eye contact. A shopkeeper turned the sign from open to closed while the captain was still in front of the window. No insults, no threats, just withdrawal. This was the community's role, not as witnesses, but as editors. They chose which version of reality would survive. A statistic circulated later among men who counted such things in neighborhoods where cooperation vanished. Violence dropped by nearly 40% within a year. At the time, no one needed the number. They felt it. Silence had replaced chaos. Fear had become structured. The captain understood now. Too late. He had mistaken restraint for weakness. The humiliation he staged in public had rippled outward, touching people who relied on predictability to survive. And predictability, once disrupted, demanded correction. At 1:15 p.m., a messenger reached him with a final clarification. Not an extension. Not a plea. Just confirmation that the 72 hours would end at 11:42 a.m., the exact minute the gun had been shown. Precision mattered. Power respected clocks. Here's the question that hangs over this moment, even now. If everyone around you refuses to act, refuses to speak, refuses to acknowledge your authority, how long do you still have power? The captain checked his watch twice in 10 minutes. He adjusted his jacket for no one. In a cafe nearby, a folded newspaper sat untouched on a table, its headline irrelevant. A spoon clinked once against a cup, then stopped. At 11:41 a.m., the captain was still alive, still standing, still calculating. At 11:40, nothing happened. That was the most frightening part. No gunshot, no confrontation, no dramatic ending, just the realization that the deadline had not been a threat of action, it had been a declaration of completion. The machinery had already done its work. Another question, one worth answering in the comments. When power disappears without a sound, is it more terrifying than when it falls in blood? The captain took a step forward. Someone stepped back. That small gesture, instinctive, communal, said everything. The city had moved on, and it would not carry him with it. The captain disappeared before anyone announced it. Not vanished, not fled, just no longer present in the places where presence used to matter. On April 19, 1936, Sunday morning, a man who normally collected envelopes near Christie Street waited an extra 20 minutes before leaving. No one arrived. He folded the empty paper he carried anyway out of habit and slipped it into his coat. That gesture, continuing a ritual after its purpose had died, was how the city marked the transition from before to after. By mid-morning, rumors replaced facts. Some said the captain was hiding in Brooklyn. Others said he had already crossed state lines. A quieter version spread too, one that made people lower their voices, that he was still in Manhattan, still walking familiar streets but no longer being acknowledged by the systems that once responded to him. Power doesn't always end with removal. Sometimes it ends with irrelevance. Statistics later confirmed what men felt instinctively that day. Within 72 hours of the deadline, nearly 85% of the captain's known intermediaries had ceased contact. Phones went unanswered. Apartments changed hands. A ledger was found abandoned in a trash bin behind a bakery, its pages smeared with grease names unreadable. Someone had tried to erase themselves in a hurry. There was a human moment that afternoon, small and devastating. A man who had served the captain loyally for years saw him across the street and did not cross. He hesitated just a second, then turned away. Loyalty once broken in public rarely survives in private. Luciano, for his part, remained largely invisible. That was intentional. He was seen briefly near a church standing off to the side, hat low, hands empty. He did not look like a victor. He looked like a man watching a structure settle after controlled demolition, checking for collapse, not celebrating it. A folded newspaper lay on the steps beside him unread. He left it there. This is where the psychological shift completed itself. The conflict was no longer between two men. It had become a lesson absorbed by everyone watching. Humiliation creates witnesses. Restraint recruits them. The captain had drawn steel to assert dominance. Luciano had drawn time. And time, when used correctly, dismantles without leaving fingerprints. Here is the question worth sitting with, not answering quickly. How many people have to stop believing in you before you are finished? By evening, the captain's name was spoken again, but differently. Past tense. Men said it the way they referenced closed theaters or demolished buildings, with mild nostalgia, with no urgency. The final confirmation came without announcement. A car that had waited outside his residence for years did not appear. No replacement arrived. No explanation followed. The street was quieter than it should have been for a Sunday night. A single light flickered in a window, then went dark. Inside, the captain sat alone. No drink, no audience. He adjusted his cuffs carefully as if preparing to be seen, then let his hands rest on the table. The silence pressed in, not hostile, not violent, just complete. No footsteps approached, no phone rang. And for the first time since the gun had been drawn, the city did not need to do anything at all. The burial took place 4 days later on April 23, 1936. Under a sky that refused to decide what it felt. Gray without rain, bright without warmth. No announcement had been made. None was needed. Men arrived in small numbers, never at the same time, never from the same direction. They stood apart from one another, hands folded, hats, low coats, buttoned despite the mild air. A folded newspaper appeared under one arm, then another. No one read them. They were props now. Symbols of a story that had already circulated far beyond the need for print. The captain's name was spoken only once by a priest who mispronounced it. No one corrected him. This was not how powerful men were usually buried. There were no crowds pressing forward, no public grief to contest the verdict. Just quiet acknowledgement. A system closing a file. What mattered wasn't the death itself. It was the timing, days after the humiliation, long enough for the city to understand that this was not rage delayed, it was consequence completed. Violence, when it finally arrived, felt almost administrative, the last step in a process that had already stripped the man of function, loyalty, and relevance. A statistic circulated later among those who measured such things after 1936. Public challenges to top leadership in New York's organized crime fell by nearly 30% over the next decade. No law caused that. No trial enforced it. Memory did. Because an unwritten rule had been established and everyone understood it without needing it explained. You may hate a man in private. You may plot against him in silence. But if you humiliate power in public, you surrender the timeline. This rule reshaped behavior. Men stopped posturing. Disputes moved indoors. Conflicts became procedural. The street learned that spectacle invited structure and structure always won. There was a final human moment that afternoon, small enough to miss. A boy too young to understand the context, old enough to sense the weight, watched the coffin lowered and asked his father why no one was crying. The father did not answer immediately. He adjusted his hat, then said only, "Because this part happened days ago." Luciano was not present. That absence was noted, then accepted. He did not need to appear. His authority no longer required visibility. That more than anything else marked the transformation. Power that must be seen is already eroding. Power that can remain unseen has learned restraint. By evening, the cemetery emptied. Footsteps faded. Engines started. A single sheet of newspaper remained on a bench near the gate, weighted down by a stone. The headline had nothing to do with any of this. That was the point. History rarely announces itself when it's being written. What endured was not the violence, but the lesson embedded in it. That control, exercised through patience, outlives control enforced through fear. That communities, when humiliated alongside a leader, remember longer than any individual ever could. And that time, precise, deliberate, unflinching, is the most effective weapon ever drawn. The city moved on, but it moved differently. And for generations afterward, when a man felt the urge to make a point in public, he remembered a gun that was never fired, a deadline that arrived without noise, and a power that vanished before the body ever fell. History rarely remembers the moment a weapon is drawn. It remembers the moment it is not used. What lingered after April 1936 was not fear, but calibration. A collective adjustment in how men measured power. Patience and consequence. The city did not celebrate what happened. It absorbed it. Like a bruise beneath a tailored suit, invisible to outsiders, tender to the touch of anyone who knew where to press. The humiliation on that sidewalk did more than wound a man. It educated a generation. It taught that violence performed for an audience weakens the performer, while restraint witnessed, remembered, whispered hardens into authority. That the most devastating retaliation is the one that gives everyone time to understand what is coming and why they will not stop it. People often ask why certain eras feel more dangerous than others. The answer is rarely in the bloodshed. It is in the silence between acts, in the coffee cups left untouched, in the folded newspapers no one bothers to read, in the way a community decides without discussion where it will stand and where it will not. Lucky Luciano did not win that week because he was crueler, faster, or louder. He won because he allowed humiliation to mature into inevitability. He trusted memory more than spectacle, and memory once shared by a community becomes law without ever being written down. Long after the names faded, the rule remained. Do not draw steel for theater. Do not humiliate what you cannot immediately dismantle. And never assume restraint is weakness, because restraint, when witnessed, becomes permission for everyone else to move against you. This is the cost of disrespect, not just death, but erasure before death ever arrives. Somewhere in the city, sidewalks were repaved, buildings changed hands, new men arrived believing they were different. But every so often, when a voice rose too loudly in public, an older man would lower his eyes, remember April 1936, and choose silence instead. That silence is still echoing.